King George II dreamed of dying valiantly on the battlefield. Instead, he suffered one of the most humiliating ends in history. Although George II was one of Great Britain's longest-serving monarchs and became an emblem of his age, he actually wasn't even British. He was born in Hanover, Germany in 1683, and French was his first language, since it was the language of the royal court. George was born into a disgraced family. His parents, Sophia Dorothea and George Louis, were notorious philanderers of their time. They carried on multiple affairs, but in 1692 his mother took one extramarital lover too many and paid a devastating price. In a scandal that rocked Europe, the Hanoverian court dissolved his parents' marriage and imprisoned his mother in a castle. The prepubescent George would never see her again. While George's father was scheming to have him marry Hedvig Sophia of Sweden, George hatched his own secret plan to find true love. In June 1705, he travelled to the court at Ansbach and went undercover as Monsieur de Buch. He was determined to find someone who loved him for his true self. But there was one person who saw straight through his disguise, probably because he was a European royal with his face plastered on paintings in every court from England to Russia, the dashing Caroline of Ansbach. George fell madly in love with Caroline, and the feeling was mutual. Love must have been in the air during the German summer of 1705. Just 1 month after they met in Ansbach, George and Caroline had finalised all of the details in their marriage contract, and a month after that, they tied the knot. But the couple's marriage got off to a rocky start. In fact, it almost ended even before it began. After giving birth to their first child, Caroline contracted smallpox. George couldn't bear the thought of losing his beloved wife and stayed by her bedside throughout her illness, but that was just the start of the nightmare. Thanks to his proximity to his sick bride, George fell ill as well. For a moment, things seemed dicey for the young couple, but fortunately, both survived. Apart from the love he had for his wife, George was passionate about fighting. The king-to-be was a military strategy fanatic. Against his father's wishes, he participated in the Battle of Oudenarde against the French. His marriage had nearly cost him his life through smallpox, but this next battle was even more dangerous. George was on the winning side, but that didn't mean he had it easy, and only narrowly escaped with his life. His unit came under heavy attack and people were falling around him like flies. Even his own colonel perished in the fight. Somehow George got away unscathed, but not before doing something supremely stupid. The Duke of Marlborough, who led the forces in the fight, wrote that the future King George II distinguished himself extremely, charging at the head of the Hanoverian troops. At the time, Queen Anne was ruling over Great Britain, but she had no heirs. As a result, it was decided that her crown would go to her cousin George Louis, George's father, after her death. She died in 1714. George Louis became King George I, and his son became Prince of Wales and heir to the throne. But these new titles came with their share of danger. While standing in for his father during a royal appointment, George attended the Theatre Royal on Drury Lane. An unknown assailant attempted to do what enemy forces hadn't been able to do on a battlefield. He tried to end George's reign before it even began. The assailant managed to take out one person in the assassination attempt, but once again, George escaped totally unharmed. And his good luck earned him one very powerful enemy. George had survived smallpox, war, and an attempt on his life, all before the age of 35. The newly minted Prince of Wales's apparent invincibility made him wildly popular in his adopted country of England. and his father, the king, took note. Either out of jealousy or mistrust, the already strained relationship between George and his father took a nosedive. In a vindictive move, his father named the Duke of Newcastle as a baptismal sponsor for George's second son, even though he knew George detested the Duke. So, at the baptism, George threw out some fighting words which, unsurprisingly, the Duke interpreted as a challenge for a duel. In order to prevent any further hostilities, George's father had to take action. Before the duel could happen, he confined George and Caroline to their chambers. But this whole baptismal setup may have been a ploy by George's deceptive and jealous father to sideline him. After confining his son to his chambers, King George ultimately decided that he didn't want him or his daughter-in-law in the royal residences and banished them from St. James's Palace altogether. He also separated the royal couple from their children and only allowed them to visit once a week. Even if George wanted to confront his father, he couldn't, because his dad was the king, and that would be treason. Still, time took care of that problem for him. By June of 1727, George's father was dead. Then, George got the last laugh. In an unprecedented move, he didn't attend the funeral. Once George became King George II, he wasted zero time indulging in the regal luxuries that his father had always denied him. After all, not only was he no longer banished from the palace, he had the keys to the whole kingdom. The new ruler decided to take an annual allowance of £800,000. That's about £100 million today. With his father out of the picture, George had no one left to fight with, and he missed the excitement of his military days. He needed to go out and make some new enemies. Against the advice of his court, he began making aggressive manoeuvres along the Prussian-Hanoverian border, and he had to make it personal. The Prussian ruler just so happened to be a relation of his. Frederick William I of Prussia wasn't just George's brother-in-law, he was also his first cousin. Frederick was just as much of a fighter as George, and he wasn't going to back down. The saber-rattling between the two cousins got so intense that an all-out conflict seemed inevitable. To stave off total disaster, diplomats from both countries suggested that the two kings settle the matter with a duel. For a guy who loved a fight, George II's response was unexpected. He declined the offer of a duel. Part of being a good military strategist is knowing when you're beaten, and George was a good military strategist. After all, Frederick William's subjects called him the Soldier King, and George didn't like the sounds of that. If George couldn't fight with his cousin, then he decided he would have to fight with another relation, namely his estranged son. While George II had been feuding with his own father in England, his son Frederick had been growing up in the Hanoverian court. By the time he came to England 14 years after his parents, father and son had nothing in common, except maybe a love for blood feuds. George might have been King of Great Britain, but he was Hanoverian by birth. By 1736, the homeland was calling to him, and George decided to take a trip. As it turned out, this was a horrible idea. Even though he had every intention of returning, his English subjects were not impressed with their abandonment. Eager to return to England before his subjects could get too angry with him, George apparently didn't check the weather report before sailing off into the English Channel. The foolhardy king sailed directly into a giant winter storm that was raging on the high seas. Back at home in England, things looked dire. Weeks went by without any sign of the king or his ship. Among his subjects, gossip began to swirl that George had died in the storm. But anyone who knew George knew that he wasn't an easy man to get rid of. 1 month later, the King of Great Britain miraculously emerged from the shore. But this time he wasn't entirely unscathed. The king's harrowing voyage had taken its toll, and he fell ill with a fever and hemorrhoids. Frederick, George's son, began spreading rumours that his father wasn't going to make it. Obviously, Junior didn't know his dad. George knew that his son was angling for his throne. He was, after all, no stranger to father-son feuds. When he heard that Frederick was spreading rumours that he was about to kick the can, he pulled himself out of bed and attended a social event, fever and all. Frederick was downright disappointed that his dad managed to survive, but there were other ways to send his father to an early grave, like a broken heart. In order to get back at his father, Frederick banned his parents from the birth of their first grandchild. Once again, though, it was George who would have the last laugh. He pulled out an old trick his father had used on him and banished Frederick from the royal palace. Instead of driving the family apart, King George should have been keeping it together, because a heartbreaking tragedy was about to strike. His wife Caroline died after an extended battle with a strangulated bowel, and George was utterly grief-stricken. According to eyewitnesses, the belligerent king displayed a tenderness of which the world thought him before utterly incapable. With her final words, Caroline urged George to remarry. He refused, saying, "No, I shall have mistresses." Talk about saying the quiet part out loud. If we know anything about George, it's that he was very much the product of his parents. Despite his intense love for Caroline, he carried on numerous affairs throughout his marriage. Although, to be fair, he kept his wife informed about all of them. More than that, some of his affairs might have bore fruit. One of George's longest affairs was with a Hanoverian noblewoman, Amalie von Valmoden. Their affair went on for nearly 30 years, and one of her two sons might actually have been George's progeny, though he never acknowledged the child. Considering his treatment of the kids he did acknowledge, that was a blessing. While George was busy ignoring the existence of the boy who might have been his son, his actual son was very busy, with a devious plan. After his mother's passing, Frederick conspired against his father by entertaining George II's political opponents at his home. But if Frederick was planning a coup, it would never come to fruition. King George's unbelievable luck continued. His scheming son Frederick died rather unexpectedly from what historians believe to have been a pulmonary embolism. And it wasn't long before George was wishing that another one of his sons would just go away. Namely his third son, the Duke of Cumberland. His crime was negotiating a peace treaty that George didn't like. According to George, his son had ruined me and disgraced himself. After more than 3 decades on the throne and a few close calls, the aging king became blind in one eye and suffered from hearing loss. Then, on the morning of October 25th, 1760, George woke up at 6 AM as always. He sipped a cup of hot chocolate and sat down on the toilet. You can probably see where this is going. King George II dreamed of dying valiantly on the battlefield. Instead, he suffered a thoracic aortic dissection while sitting on the loo. After hearing a loud crash, his valet rushed in to find George on the floor. The attendants lifted him into his bed and called for his daughter, Princess Amelia. Sadly, by the time the princess arrived, George was dead. In his will, he'd requested to be buried next to his wife, but unusually he wanted the sides of their coffins removed so that their remains could mingle. Heartwarming. In the end, George II was probably more of a lover than a fighter, if you exclude his father, his brother-in-law, his son, and his other son. And that time he charged into a bloody battle. Either way, history looks kindly on him. As one source claimed, his character would not afford subject for epic poetry, but will look well in the sober page of history. And we'll never look at hot chocolate the same way again. Thanks for watching History Exposé. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factinate, for more incredible facts about everything.